The morning sun cast long shadows across the fresh grave. Thora Lindquist stood before the simple wooden cross, her children pressed close on either side. Signy clutched her mother's right hand. Anders held the left. Neither spoke. The cross read only, Erik Lindqvist, Belove. 1 month. It had been 1 month since the logging accident. 1 month since 2 men from the timber camp arrived at her door with their hats in their hands. 1 month since she stopped being a wife and became something else entirely. A widow. A woman alone. The September wind stirred the prairie grass beyond the small cemetery plot. Thora's faded blue wool dress rippled against her legs. Her light brown hair, pulled into a single braid, caught strands of morning light. She looked older than 32. The past weeks had carved new lines around her eyes. "Mama," Anders tugged her sleeve. "Is Papa cold under there?" "No, little one." She stroked his hair. "Papa feels nothing now. He's at peace." Signy said nothing. At 8, she understood too much. Her silence was its own kind of grief. The sound of hoofbeats broke the morning quiet. Thora turned to see 2 riders approaching from the direction of town. She recognized the first, Mr. Pembroke from the general store, his round face troubled beneath his worn hat. The second rider made her stomach tighten. Garrett Holloway sat tall in his saddle. His expensive brown wool coat marked him as the wealthiest rancher in 3 counties. His dark hair was graying at the temples, and his face wore an expression she had learned to distrust, concern that masked something harder. "Mrs. Lindquist." Pembroke dismounted heavily. He wouldn't meet her eyes. "I'm sorry to intrude on your morning." "Then why have you?" Pembroke twisted his hat in his hands. "It's about your husband's account, the debt." Thora felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Eric had mentioned owing money at the store. Supplies for his project's lumber, tools. She hadn't known the amount. "Your husband owed $47, Pembroke said. "I'm sorry, truly. But Mr. Holloway here has purchased the debt." Garrett Holloway dismounted with the easy grace of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. He removed his hat, revealing that practiced smile she'd seen at church gatherings and town meetings. Now, his voice was smooth as creek water over stone. "I'm not unreasonable, Mrs. Lindquist. $47 is a considerable sum for a widow with 2 young children. I understand that. What do you want, Mr. Holloway?" "Only to help." He gestured at the land surrounding them, the rocky farmland, the pine forest on the distant hills, the creek cutting through the property. "This land is difficult. Remote, the soil is poor. A widow alone cannot possibly work 40 acres. It would be cruel to expect it. What are you proposing?" "I'll forgive the debt entirely, and give you $30 besides. That's enough to start fresh somewhere else. Perhaps your family back in Sweden." "My family is here." Thora pulled her children closer. "This is our home." Garrett's smile didn't waver, but his eyes hardened slightly. "Mrs. Lindquist, be reasonable. You have 60 days to repay the debt. 60 days. If you cannot pay, the law allows me to petition for the land. I'm offering you a way out. $30 for 40 acres. The land is worthless to you. You cannot farm it alone. The nearest mill is 2 days away. How will you grind your wheat? How will you survive the winter?" He leaned closer, his voice dropping. "I'm being generous. Others would simply wait for you to fail." Thora looked at the creek. The water caught the morning light, sparkling as it rushed over the rocks. Eric had loved that creek. He'd spent hours there working on something he called their future. "I will find a way," she said. Garrett laughed, a short, dismissive sound. "Would what? Your husband's unfinished follies? That pile of wood by the creek?" He shook his head. "A widow alone cannot work this land, Mrs. Lindquist." "That's not cruelty, that's simply fact." He mounted his horse. 60 days. Think carefully." The two men rode away, leaving Thora standing at her husband's grave with her children pressed against her sides. Anders looked up at her. "Mama, are we going to lose our home?" She knelt down, taking both children's faces in her hands. "No, we are not." She looked toward the creek, where Eric's half-built wheel frame stood like a skeleton against the sky. "Your father had a plan, and I'm going to finish it." The cabin felt emptier now than it had even in those first terrible days. Eric's coat still hung by the door. His boots still stood beneath the window. But his presence, that warm, solid certainty she had leaned against for 9 years, was gone. Thora moved through the small space like a ghost. The children were outside, Signe watching Anders while he played by the woodpile. Through the window, she could see the wheel frame by the creek. 8 feet tall, skeletal, unfinished. She needed to clean, to organize, to do something with her hands while her mind raced through impossible calculations. $47, 60 days. Even if she ground all their wheat by hand, made flour to sell, it wouldn't be enough. Hand grinding produced 2 pounds per hour of exhausting work. She would need months, not weeks. Her hand brushed against a drawer she hadn't opened since before the accident. Eric's drawer. His tools were in the shed. But this held his papers. His drawings. The private thoughts he committed to paper in the evenings while she sewed and the children slept. She pulled it open. A leather notebook lay on top. She recognized it. He'd carried it everywhere, making notes, sketching ideas. She opened it with trembling fingers. The first pages were drawings. Detailed, precise, beautiful. A water wheel, 6 feet in diameter with 8 paddles. Below it, gears, a shaft, millstones. And in his careful handwriting, for Thora, "When the wheel turns, we'll never need to make that mill trip again. The creek will do the work." She turned the pages, more drawings, measurements. Calculations she didn't fully understand. Creek flow at the bend, 4 cubic feet per second. Sufficient for 6-foot wheel at 10 rotations per minute. Gear ratio 1005, stone at 50 RPM. Eric had planned this for years. He'd been building their future, one calculation at a time. Deeper in the notebook, a folded paper. She opened it carefully. Bill of sale, 2 millstones from Halverson Estate Auction. 2 feet diameter, excellent condition. $8 paid in full. She nearly dropped the paper. Millstones, real grinding stones, but where? She ran outside, past the confused children, around to the back of the cabin. There, beneath a weathered canvas tarp, 2 massive circles of gray granite lay hidden in the tall grass. 400 pounds each. The bedstone and the runner stone. Everything needed to grind grain. Eric had bought them, hidden them, waiting for the right moment. "Mama," Signe appeared at her side. "What are those?" "Your father's secret." Thora touched the cold stone. "His gift to us." That evening, old Mrs. Bergstrom arrived with soup for the children, as she had every few days since the funeral. The Swedish widow had buried her own husband 15 years ago. She understood grief's rhythms. "You found his notebook," she said, seeing it open on the table. Thora nodded. He was building a mill. A water-powered grinding mill. The wheel frame is already up. The stones are behind the cabin. He was so close. Your Eric was a clever man. But I'm not a clever woman. Thora's voice cracked. I don't know how to finish it. I don't understand half his drawings. Mrs. Bergstrom sat down across from her. Her weathered hands folded on the table. Let me tell you something my mother told me, back in Sweden. A woman who waits for permission waits forever. A woman who creates opportunity finds her own way. I don't even know where to begin. You begin with what you know. The old woman tapped the notebook. Your Eric left you everything you need. The question is whether you trust him enough to follow. Outside, the creek rushed past the silent wheel frame. The water never stopped. Day and night, it flowed, waiting for someone to put it to work. The idea came to her at 3 in the morning, when sleep had abandoned her entirely. She sat at the table with Eric's notebook open, studying his drawings by candlelight. The wheel, the gears, the stones. It was all there, every measurement, every calculation. He had left her a blueprint. She just needed to follow it. But even if she finished the wheel, even if it worked, how would that pay $47 in 60 days? She remembered what Garrett had said. The nearest mill is 2 days away. 2 days there, 2 days back. 4 days for a single grinding trip. And the miller at Halverson charged 1/8 toll. 1 pound of every 8 went to him. Dora did the math in her head. If she could grind grain here at her creek, she wouldn't need to sell flour. She could sell the service, like the miller at Halverson, but charging less. 1/16 instead of 1/8, half the toll, no 2-day trip. Every farmer within 10 miles would come to her. She was out of bed before dawn, studying the wheel frame in the gray morning light. Eric had built the main structure, the vertical supports, the horizontal shaft, the mounting brackets. What remained was detail work, carving the 8 paddles, attaching them at precise angles, connecting the gears, running the belt to the millstones. Hard work, but not impossible work. She found Mrs. Bergstrom that afternoon, walking to her cabin with determination she hadn't felt in weeks. I need your help. The old woman looked up from her vegetable garden. Tell me, if I finish Eric's wheel, if I can grind grain, would you bring your wheat to me? Would your husband? Mrs. Bergstrom's eyes widened. You would grind our grain? Here? Half the toll of Halverson. 1/16 instead of 1/8. And no 4-day trip. The old woman rose slowly, her face transforming. Child, if you could do this. Do you understand what it would mean? Every family for miles struggles with those mill trips. Old Hanson's wife missed her daughter's wedding because they couldn't spare the 4 days. Will you spread the word? After I prove it works? I'll do more than that. Mrs. Bergstrom clasped her hands. My grandson, Lars, he worked for a carpenter in St. Paul. He owes me a favor. I'll have him come help with the difficult parts. 3 days later, Thora stood at the wheel frame with Lars Bergstrom, a quiet young man of 20 with strong hands and a patient manner. He studied Eric's drawings carefully. Your husband was a fine engineer, he said. These calculations are solid. The hard part is already done. We just need to carve the paddles and connect the drive system. Can we finish in time? I have 53 days. Lars looked at the creek, at the frame, at the hidden millstones behind the cabin. If we work every day, we can finish in 4 weeks, maybe 3. The sound of hoofbeats interrupted them. Garrett Holloway rode up to the property line, his eyes taking in the scene, the widow, the young man, the wheel frame. What's this, Mrs. Lindquist? Hired help? His voice dripped with false concern. I didn't think you could afford workers. He's a neighbor helping a neighbor. Dora kept her voice steady. Nothing more. Garrett studied Lars, then the wheel frame. That thing again, your husband's folly. Are you actually trying to finish it? I'm cleaning up his projects, as you suggested. Garrett's eyes narrowed slightly. Something in her tone had changed. She wasn't defeated anymore. Don't work too hard, widow. You'll need your strength for packing. He rode away. Thora watched him go, her jaw tight. He doesn't know, Lars said quietly. He doesn't understand what this wheel can do. Good. Thora picked up Eric's straw knife. Let's keep it that way. The next 3 weeks blurred into a rhythm of exhaustion and purpose. Thora woke before dawn each day, fed the children, and went to work. Lars arrived shortly after, and together they carved, shaped, measured, and assembled. The paddles came first, 8 of them, each 18 inches wide and 12 inches deep, carved from oak that Erit had seasoned in the shed. Every paddle had to be identical. Any variation would cause the wheel to wobble and fail. Measure 3 times, Lars reminded her, cut once. Thora's hands blistered the first week. She wrapped them in cloth and kept working. By the second week, calluses had formed. By the third, she hardly noticed the ache anymore. Signy and Anders watched from a distance at first, then slowly joined in. Signy helped hold boards steady while her mother cut. Anders gathered wood shavings for kindling. Small tasks, but they made the children feel useful. One evening, Anders asked why they were working so hard. Thora wiped sawdust from her face. "Do you remember what Papa used to say about working smarter?" Anders shook his head. "He used to say that strong men lift heavy things. Smart people find ways not to lift at all." She gestured at the wheel, now with 4 paddles attached. "That's what this is. The creek is strong, much stronger than any of us. We're just asking it to help." Signy looked at her mother with new understanding. "Like a friend?" "Yes, little one, like a friend who never gets tired." The gear system proved the most difficult challenge. Eric had designed a wooden lantern gear, a cylinder with pegs around its circumference, that would mesh with a crown wheel to transfer power from the vertical wheel shaft to the horizontal millstone spindle. Lars understood the concept, but cutting the precise angles required patience that nearly broke them both. 6 degrees off, Lars said on the 4th attempt. "The teeth won't mesh." Thora stared at the ruined gear, exhaustion pressing behind her eyes. 22 days gone, 38 remaining. Then we cut it again. On the 5th attempt, the teeth meshed perfectly. The gear spun smooth and true. The leather belt came from Eric's old work harness, triple layered, strong enough to transfer the rotation without snapping. Moving the millstone seemed impossible until Thora remembered her grandfather's stories about moving heavy loads on ice. She built a wooden sled and had the children pour creek water in front of it as she pulled. The stone slid across the wet ground inch by inch, over 3 exhausting days. On day 37, Lars stood back and looked at their work. "It's done," he said quietly. The wheel stood complete. 6 feet of shaped oak, 8 paddles perfectly aligned, mounted over the rushing creek. The shaft extended into the small mill shed that built over the stone foundation. Inside, the gears waited connected by leather belt to the millstone spindle. 2 granite stones, the fixed bedstone and the rotating runner, sat ready, their surfaces carved with grooves for cutting grain. Thora touched the wheel. It was real. They had built it. A horse snorted behind them. Garrett Holloway sat in his saddle at the property line, his face a mask she couldn't read. "What is that?" Thora turned to face him. "My husband's project. I finished it. That's..." He rode closer, studying the wheel. "That's a water mill. A grinding mill." His voice changed, the mockery replaced by something else. "A woman cannot." "Cannot what, Mr. Holloway?" He stared at her for a long moment. The woman before him was not the same grieving widow he'd confronted a month ago. Sawdust clung to her braid. Calluses marked her hands. Her blue dress was faded and worn, but her eyes held something new, something dangerous. 23 days, widow." He pulled his horse around. "You still owe $47? A wheel won't change that." Mrs. Bergstrom arrived on day 40 with 3 sacks of wheat in her wagon. Her husband sat beside her, his weathered face skeptical but curious. "My wife tells me you can grind grain," Mr. Bergstrom said. "Here, without traveling to Halverson." "I can." Thora gestured toward the creek. "If you'll follow me." The small group gathered at the mill shed. The Bergstroms, Thora, the children, Lars. The wheels stood motionless, paddles positioned above the water. A wooden sluice gate held back the creek's flow. "Are you ready?" Lars asked. Thora nodded. She pulled the lever that raised the gate. Water rushed through. It struck the first paddle with a sound like distant thunder. The wheel groaned, creaked, and began to turn. Inside the shed, the gears engaged with a grinding click. The leather belt pulled taut. The runner stone began to spin, slowly at first, then faster as the wheel found its rhythm. "Pour in the grain," Thora said. Mrs. Bergstrom lifted a bucket of wheat and fed it into the wooden hopper above the stones. Golden kernels cascaded down through the eye of the runner stone, flowing between the spinning surfaces. 20 minutes passed. The stones ground steadily, the creek providing endless power. Then, from the collection trough below the stones, a stream of fine flour poured out, golden and soft as silk. Mrs. Bergstrom covered her mouth with her hands. Her husband stared, speechless. "It works," the old woman whispered. "Sweet heaven, it actually works." Word spread faster than wildfire. Within a week, 3 more families brought grain. Then 5, then 8. Thora charged 1/16 toll, half what Halverson charged, and farmers saved 4 days of travel besides. The creek ran day and night. Thora ran the mill from dawn until dusk, grinding load after load, collecting her toll and grain that she stored in the cabin's small cellar. The children helped, Signe managing the hopper, Anders sweeping the shed floor clean between customers. On day 52, Thora counted her earnings. $16 in coin, plus nearly 200 pounds of grain as toll, more than she'd ever earned in a month. Not enough, not yet, but close. That same afternoon, Sheriff Carlson arrived at her property. His face was troubled. "Mrs. Lindquist, I have bad news." Behind him, Garrett Holloway dismounted with a folded paper in his hand. "I filed a formal complaint," Garrett said. "Under Minnesota Territorial Statute, commercial milling requires a permit. That permit must be signed by the property owner." He smiled, cold, triumphant. "You don't own this property free and clear, Mrs. Lindquist. You're a debtor, which means you have no right to operate a commercial mill." Sheriff Carlson handed her the paper. "Cease and desist order. I'm sorry. Until the debt is settled and a proper permit obtained, you cannot operate." Thora's hands shook as she read the words. All her work, all those grinding hours, stopped by a piece of paper. Garrett leaned close. "Did you think you could outsmart me, widow? I own that debt. I decide when it's paid." His voice dropped to a whisper. "Sell me the land. $40 now. I'm feeling generous. Or lose everything in 8 days." He mounted his horse and rode away, leaving Thora standing in the silence of her stopped wheel. That night, Thora sat alone by the motionless wheel. The children slept inside. The moon cast silver light across the creek, which rushed past the still paddles with its usual indifferent energy. The water didn't care about permits or debts or widows. She had been so close. $16 saved, customers arriving daily. Another 3 weeks, and she would have earned enough to pay the debt in full. Now it was over. She thought about Garrett's offer. $40. Enough to travel somewhere, St. Paul, perhaps? She could find work there. Scrubbing floors, taking in laundry. The children could attend a proper school. It would be safer than this, easier than this. Except it wasn't her home. It wasn't Eric's dream. And taking Garrett's money would mean admitting that everyone who had doubted her was right. A widow alone cannot work this land. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory. Words from a cold evening in Sweden, when young Thora had complained about unfair rules that bound women to men's decisions. When a man closes the door, don't beat against it. Find the window. Or build a new door altogether. Find a new door. Thora returned to the cabin. She dug through Eric's papers until she found what she was looking for, the original land claim documents. Eric had been meticulous. Everything was there, including a copy of the Homestead Act provisions he had annotated in his careful handwriting. She read by candlelight until her eyes burned. One passage stopped her cold. A widow of a homesteader who has made improvements to the claim and demonstrated ability to work the land may petition for continued residency pending debt resolution. Such petition requires sworn testimony of witnesses to improvements made. Witnesses, the neighbors. The people whose grain she had ground. They had seen what she built. They had seen it work. If she could get them to testify. At dawn, she rode to Mrs. Bergstrom's cabin. "I need your help." Not with grinding, with something else entirely. The old woman listened. Her face grew serious, then thoughtful, then bright with something like hope. "How many witnesses do you need?" "As many as I can get." "The hearing is in 6 days." Mrs. Bergstrom smiled, a fierce, determined expression. "Child, you've saved every family in this valley time and money they didn't have. You've fed babies who hadn't tasted fresh bread in months. Do you really think they'll abandon you now?" She took Thora's hands. "Let me talk to them. All of them. We'll give that snake Holloway a surprise he won't forget." Day 58. The county courthouse in Millbrook Hollow was a modest wooden building that served as church, meeting hall, and court of law depending on the day. Today it served justice. Thora arrived early, her children beside her. She wore her cleanest dress, still faded blue, still patched at the elbows, and had braided her hair carefully. Signe held her right hand. Anders held her left. They had not let go since leaving the cabin. Garrett Holloway was already there with his lawyer, a thin man from St. Paul who smelled of tobacco and condescension. They sat at the front, confident, prepared. Sheriff Carlson stood to one side. Judge Engström, a gray-haired Norwegian who had homesteaded this valley 30 years ago, presided from behind a simple wooden table. "This hearing will determine the disposition of the Lindquist property," he announced. "Mr. Holloway claims default on a debt of $47. Mrs. Lindquist has petitioned for continued residency under the Homestead Act widow provision. We will hear both sides." Garrett's lawyer spoke first. Smooth words about contracts and debts and the importance of upholding legal obligations. The law was clear. The money was owed. The widow could not pay. Furthermore, the lawyer concluded, Mrs. Lindquist has operated an unlicensed commercial mill on property she does not own free and clear. This demonstrates poor judgment, not the ability to manage a homestead. Judge Engström turned to Thora. "Mrs. Lindquist, how do you respond?" She stood, her children releasing her hands reluctantly. "Your Honor, I do not have $47, but I have something else." "And what is that?" "Proof." She turned toward the courtroom doors. "Under the Homestead Act provision for widows, I petition for continued residency based on demonstrated improvements and ability to work the claim. I call witnesses." The doors opened. Mrs. Bergstrom entered first. Behind her came her husband. Then the Nilssons. Then the Jens. Then the Andersons, the Larsons, the Petersons. Family after family filed into the small courtroom until the benches were full and people stood against the walls. 12 families, 37 people. Garrett's face went pale. "Your Honor." Mrs. Bergstrom stepped forward. "In the past 3 weeks, Mrs. Lindquist has ground over 600 pounds of grain for our community. She built a working water mill with her own hands, following her late husband's designs. She charges half what the Halverson mill charges. She has saved us dozens of trips and hundreds of hours of travel." Mr. Nilsson stood. My wife baked bread for the first time in 3 months because of Mrs. Lindquist's mill. We couldn't afford the trip to Halverson. Our children had been eating porridge for weeks. Mrs. Jensen, holding her infant daughter, my baby, was sick. I couldn't leave her for 4 days. Mrs. Lindquist ground our wheat so I could stay home and nurse her. One by one, they spoke. Stories of hardship eased. Families fed. Time returned to people who had none to spare. Judge Engstrom listened in silence. When the testimonies ended, he turned to Garrett. Mr. Holloway, the law states that a creditor acting in bad faith, purchasing debt specifically to force foreclosure for personal gain, may have his claim challenged. He gestured at the gathered crowd. It appears Mrs. Lindquist has demonstrated not only ability to work her claim, but has become essential to this community. Garrett sputtered, Your Honor, the debt is valid and will be repaid. The judge's voice hardened. I am ordering a 6-month stay on collection. Mrs. Lindquist will make monthly payments of $8 until the debt is satisfied. The mill may continue operating under a provisional permit, to be made permanent upon debt resolution. He struck his gavel. This hearing is adjourned. The week following the hearing, business at the mill doubled. Word had spread, the widow who stood up to Garrett Holloway. The woman who built a mill with her own hands. Farmers came from valleys Thora had never heard of, bringing grain and leaving with flour and stories. Signe and Anders worked beside her now as partners, not just helpers. Signe had learned to adjust the hopper feed for different grain types. Anders swept the mill floor so efficiently that flour never built up in the corners. They were proud of their mother, of themselves, of the wheel that turned and never stopped. 8 days after the hearing, Garrett Holloway returned. Thora was adjusting the sluice gate when she saw him riding down the path. She straightened slowly, wiping flour from her hands. He dismounted without his usual swagger. His face looked older somehow, tired. Mrs. Lindquist. Mr. Holloway. A long pause. The wheel turned behind her, paddles splashing through the rushing water. I have 300 pounds of grain. His voice was flat, stripped of its former smoothness. My foreman tells me hand grinding isn't keeping up with demand. The cattle need feed. Thora said nothing. She waited. The trip to Halverson would take 4 days. I don't have 4 days. He reached into his pocket and pulled out coins. The toll is 1/16. I'll pay in advance. You could build your own mill, Mr. Holloway. You have the men, the resources. Not the time, not the knowledge. He looked at the wheel, really looked at it for the first time. Your husband designed that? Yes. He was. He was a skilled man. He was. Thora took the coins, counted them. Correct. Bring your grain. I'll grind it by week's end. Garrett turned to leave, then stopped. His shoulders seemed to sag. For what it's worth. He didn't turn around. You proved me wrong. I didn't think you could do it. I didn't think any woman could do what you've done. I know. I was wrong. He mounted his horse and rode away. That evening, Thora sat with her children by the creek. The wheel turned steadily, its rhythm so familiar now that she barely heard it. Fireflies danced over the water. The summer air was warm and sweet. Mama? Signe leaned against her shoulder. Are we safe now? Thora pulled both children close. We're safe. Because of the wheel? Because of what the wheel taught us. She watched the paddles turn, the water spray catching the last light of sunset. That we don't have to be stronger than everyone else. We just have to be smarter and braver and willing to try things others won't. Anders yaunt. I like the wheel. So do I, little one, so do I. 3 years passed like water through the wheel. The mill expanded. Where once a simple shed had stood, now a proper building rose, with a waiting area where farmers gathered to share news while their grain was ground. Thora had paid off the debt in 11 months, 5 months early. She'd purchased more land, 20 acres of the forest that Eric had loved. The wheel itself had been rebuilt twice. Oak wore down, leather belts frayed, but the water kept flowing, and the stones kept turning, and the flour kept pouring golden and fine into sacks that traveled to tables across 3 counties. A carpenter named Henrik Johansson had arrived 2 years ago seeking work. He stayed to help maintain the wheel, then to build an addition, then simply to be near the woman whose strength he admired. They married in the spring in a ceremony by the creek where her first husband had dreamed of wheels and gears and futures. Henrik understood. He didn't try to replace Eric. He built alongside his memory. On a crisp autumn morning, a young widow named Clara arrived at the mill. Her dress was worn. Her eyes were tired. She carried her first sack of grain like it weighed 100 pounds. Thora recognized that weight. It wasn't the grain. "First time?" she asked. Clara nodded. "My husband died last spring. Everyone says I should sell the claim and move to town. They say a woman alone cannot." "Cannot what?" Clara stopped, looked up. "Let me tell you something my grandmother told me." Thora took the young woman's hands. "A woman who waits for permission waits forever. A woman who creates opportunity finds her own way." "But how? I don't know how to do anything." "I don't have skills like you." "Neither did I, not at first." Thora gestured at the wheel at the mill, at the life she had built from grief and sawdust and determination. "My husband left me drawings and I followed them. My grandmother left me words and I believed them. My neighbors had needs and I filled them." She squeezed Clara's hands. "You don't have to sell. You don't have to leave. You just have to find what you can create. What you can offer that others need." Clara's eyes glistened. "How did you know it would work?" Dora smiled. "I didn't. But my grandmother used to say, 'Water doesn't rest.' Why should you kill yourself when the creek can do the work?" The phrase had spread through Millbrook Hollow and beyond. When someone struggled alone with a task that could be done smarter, someone would say it. When a young person faced an impossible problem, an elder would remind them, "Let the creek do the work." It meant, find a better way. Work with your mind, not just your muscles. And never let anyone tell you that you cannot. Years later, when Thora's hair had turned gray and her hands had grown slower, she would sit by the creek on autumn afternoons and watch the wheel turn. Signy ran the mill now, with her own children helping. Anders had become a carpenter like his father, building water wheels for 3 other towns. The water kept flowing. It always had. It always would. And somewhere in the wind that stirred the prairie grass, in the spray that caught the afternoon light, in the steady rhythm of paddles turning and stones grinding and flour pouring golden into waiting sacks, Eric's dream lived on. Not just a wheel, a legacy. The end.